Would you trust your life to something that people have studied for centuries and still don't understand, and that takes a supercomputer to even get close to figuring out? Well, this morning it looks like I'm going to be doing that. For those of you interested in investing, check out WeBull, an amazing platform for buying and selling stocks, and now cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Dogecoin, and others. Open an account and get a free stock valued at up to $200, and fund your account and get another free stock valued at up to $2,300. Check out the link in the description and help the channel at the same time. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. So yes, indeed, I will be jumping out of an airplane this morning. It appears that it is very lovely weather. There was a dense fog advisory, and so I thought maybe I'd get out of this, but it looks like I'm actually going to be jumping out of an airplane. A perfectly good airplane with a parachute. I will be doing a tandem jump, so I'm basically just luggage, so no big deal. But anyway, I wanted to do an episode about parachutes because parachutes are incredibly complicated, and the whole physics of parachutes is incredibly complicated. And if you're like me, if you have a background in physics and you're sort of like a person that enjoys this kind of stuff, you don't just sort of blindly trust to it. You can see I actually lost some sleep last night over this. So anyway, I'm quite a little bit nervous this morning. We're going to Skydive Monroe, and they're about 45 minutes away from my house in Athens, and I think they're about a half hour from Atlanta. So if you're interested in going yourself, they're lovely people. I highly recommend it. But anyway, as I'm sure you know, millions of people have jumped out of airplanes with parachutes, all the way from the military to experimental parachutes to, astronauts coming back from space, right? So it's like, what's the big deal about this? Well, if you look back at it, Leonardo DaVinci thought about this. A bunch of physicists in the 19th century thought about this. In the 20th century, luminaries, such as NASA and Roscosmos and SpaceX have done massive experimentation on it. And if memory serves, the very last thing that SpaceX had to do to get their Crew Dragon certified for human flight with NASA was parachutes. They were working on that up until the 11th hour. And of course, any young physicist slash daredevil, well, it would be me, who decided that they were going to jump off their second-story garage roof with an umbrella because it had to work, right? Because Mary Poppins worked, and because, hey, it's just like a parachute, and landed on their butt really, really hard instead of landing on their feet, knows that this stuff is not as simple as it looks like on the surface. So what is the big deal? Why is this so difficult? It turns out that this actually has to do with something that was kind of codified in the 19th century, and it has to do with fluid flow. And yes, air, this stuff here is actually considered a fluid. It's a compressible fluid as opposed to an incompressible fluid. An incompressible fluid is something like liquid. That's something where if liquid was compressible, you would not be able to swim. So, you have to have something. It has to do with the way the molecules are shaped. The molecules are very close together in liquid, and they slide apart, right, as opposed to a solid where they're in a crystalline structure. In liquid, they can slide over each other, but they can't really smash into each other. They can't squish even closer than they were before. As opposed to that, air is a fluid, but air is a compressible fluid. In other words, if you squeeze it, the molecules will get closer together because there's a lot of space between them. And then, of course, just to be complete, the fourth state of matter is plasma, and that is something where if you see, like a fusion reactor or actually out in space, that you just have separated protons and electrons. And so those are charged particles. The difference between that and air, of course, number one is temperature, but actually it doesn't even have to be temperature. But essentially, it just has to do with the fact that all these air molecules are bound. You've got protons, neutrons in the nucleus, and you've got electrons floating around them. So they're electrically neutral as opposed to a plasma, which has an electric charge. So that's the different states of matter. But the one we care about is compressible fluids, which is air in this case. And that's what we're going to deal with today. I'm going to talk through this whole process, and we're going to get into some of the physics and why this is so complicated and why we actually depend on turbulence. We depend on an incredibly complex interaction of molecules and the object that we're working with in order to make this work. If we didn't have turbulent flow, we would die when we parachuted out of an airplane. So that's kind of a wild thing, to depend on chaos, essentially, in order to survive. And by the way, I'm going to do another related video to this on my other channel, which is Whole Nuts and Donuts. It doesn't get an awful lot of love. If you want to go check it out and just see the kind of skydiving part of it, the more adventure part without all the physics background and explainer stuff, definitely check it out. I'll leave a link in the description and maybe put a card up in the corner for that as well. That channel actually is like, I think it has 936 subscribers, so it would be lovely if you'd go and subscribe, because if I get to 1,000, I have a bunch of really cool videos on there and I don't make a penny off of them because I don't have 1,000 subscribers. So if you want to be nice, you could go and subscribe to that as well and watch that video as well, because it's just going to be the parachuting part. So anyway, I'm going to spend a lot of today talking about the physics of all of this stuff, but me and my friend Paige are going to go and do this. So part of it is going to be us actually jumping out of the airplane and also some of the training, and probably me asking way more questions to the skydive instructors than they really want to hear about from me. So wish me luck on that as well, because I'm sure they're going to be like, oh, please stop asking questions. That is the way I learn. So sorry, that's the way it's going to go. Alrighty, let's make this happen, right? Oh, wish me luck. We've been talking about this for like 3 years, I think, right?
Yes.
We were having dinner one night together.
I think it was Christmas dinner.
Yeah, it was like Christmas dinner like 3 years ago. So anyway, and then we were like, we need to do this. And I have like a bucket list thing. I have a bucket list. This is number 2 on my bucket list. Number 1 is going south of the equator. So this is going to knock off number 2 on the list. But also every year, like my New Year's resolution is to do something completely new. So we're doing something completely new.
And I asked you about this a couple years ago, not knowing that we would actually follow through with it and do it.
It only took 3. It was supposed to happen last year, but COVID, yeah. Mm-hmm. As with so many things in life. Air is also considered to be a fluid, but air is compressible, and that's the difference between it and liquids, more or less, you know, it's not exact. But anyway, what you have is with air, of course, the molecules of air are not really connected to each other. They just sort of individually bounce around. They hit each other, they bounce off, and the pressure that we feel, if you blow up a balloon or something, what you're doing is you're injecting more and more air into that balloon, so the molecules don't have as long to travel before they hit each other. And that, of course, equates to what we call pressure on a macroscopic level, and that's what makes the balloon get bigger. And of course, as most of you know, I'm sure, that we have 15 pounds per square inch, or 1 bar, of pressure on us at the surface of the Earth, more or less. Obviously depends. If you go up a mountain, it's going to be less. If you go down very, very low in like Death Valley or something, it'll be a little bit more. So anyway, we have that much pressure on us. We don't feel that. If you imagine that, that's like, you know, a bar is pressing on every single little bit of your body, but it's pressing from every direction, so we don't really notice it that much. What we do notice, on the other hand, is the viscosity and the friction of air. And that would be, as you wave your hand around like this, right, you can feel the air molecules hitting your hand and bouncing off. And actually at this level, it feels like it's cooling. If you go fast enough, of course, it will become heated, because you will create enough friction that it will actually become hot, and it will make your skin hot. Now, I do not recommend going at the speed where if you put your hand out the window of a jet plane or something like that, you're going to be heating up your hand. That's probably a bad idea. But it would happen if you go to high enough levels of speed. And of course, that's one of the reasons why things like supersonic airplanes have to be made out of very, very tough, or spacecraft or something, have to be made out of very, very tough materials that can withstand really, really high heating. So friction is definitely a part of air, and of course viscosity is also a part of any fluid. So viscosity, the obvious thing is to say something like water, which has kind of a medium level of viscosity, versus honey or something like that that has a high level of viscosity, right? So if you pour water out, water pours very easily, has a kind of a medium level of viscosity. Whereas if you pour honey out, it takes a very, very long time for the honey to come out, because it's got very, very high viscosity. And of course, all of these things are related to pressure and temperature and all of this other stuff, right? The standard temperature and pressure is a consistent thing that you would have seen if you've taken any sort of college level physics classes or anything like that. And speaking of college level physics classes, fluids like air can be described by the Navier-Stokes equations. These are really wretchedly difficult. They're partial differential equations, and I know if you have never taken even calculus, you're like, what the heck is he talking about? But essentially, instead of taking one derivative of something, you're taking a derivative in like every direction you can go. So 3-dimensional derivatives in the case of the Navier-Stokes equations. Anyway, they're gnarly and they're not generally solvable, and that's one of the big problems with things like parachutes. We're depending on equations of motion that cannot actually be generally solved. And specifically in the case of parachutes, we're actually looking at turbulent airflow. That's a critical element to how parachutes actually function properly. And turbulence is particularly difficult to solve with these equations. So of course that brings us to the two states of fluid flow. One of them is called laminar. And again, if you think about laminating something, right, back in the old days, you put like a sheet of plastic over something and heat it up so it sticks to like your card, so your ID card is laminated. So laminar just means like sheets of things, and that just means it's very well behaved. If you flow a fluid over something like a wing shape or something, you see that the different pieces of the fluid actually kind of stick together for the most part, at least over the front part of the wing. They start to become turbulent towards the back part of the wing. And in general, for most human things, we want to get rid of turbulence as much as possible. For example, when you're flying an aircraft, the turbulence that develops at the back end of a wing, and this is a really lovely demonstration of this fluid flow over a wing. It's using water instead of air, but it works generally the same way. And you can see how there's turbulence at the back end of the wing, and it starts to create vortices, and those vortices create drag, which is essentially a lower pressure area behind it, but is a very chaotic lower pressure area. And it's very difficult to determine exactly what's going to happen there without either looking at it in a physical simulation like this or using very, very powerful like supercomputer fluid simulations that use finite element analysis to try to get as close as they can to solving these problems analytically. So again, let's look at the Clark Y airfoil that I showed a little bit ago, and I'm going to put references to all of these papers and videos and everything that I used as research for this thing in the description, so definitely check those out. I am giving a kind of a generalized overview, but if you want to go even deeper, just look in the description and you can see all of these things, and you can go as deep as you want to into this. So anyway, as I said, this is water, not air, but at slow speeds, the flow is relatively similar. And you can see that at a low angle of attack, there is smooth flow with turbulence. Again, that equates to drag only near the end of the wing. Also note that before we get to the actual turbulent flow at the rear, there's a separation that precedes the turbulent flow, where the laminar flow actually detaches from the wing surface, and that is what leads to turbulence. And that's a really interesting physical aspect of a lot of these sort of transitional states. And it's something that I can't really go into in this video because it's too deep in terms of the physics and the mathematics, but it's a really interesting factor that what you get when you transition from laminar to turbulent is there's a kind of intermediate stage where it starts to detach from laminar and the laminar sheets start to actually interact with each other, and that's what generates the chaotic turbulence you see at the back of the wing. Interestingly enough, we can also see from this same video that a high angle of attack for the wing, which means it's more of like kind of facing into the wind, there's a much higher turbulence over most of the wing, and that of course leads to a lot of drag. So the first part of my parachute trip, where I was freaking out more than a little bit, used mostly laminar airflow over the wings of an aircraft to lift the plane into the air and up to about 15,000 feet or about 4,570 meters. And just as a point of reference, this aircraft is unpressurized, obviously, since you have to be able to open the door, and this is higher up than Mount Rainier, which is about 4,400 meters. And as another side note here, if you stayed up at the altitude of 15,000 feet or 4,500 meters for very long, you'd actually get oxygen deprivation and feel woozy since you've had no time to acclimatize. And of course, you know, what happens is we go up and we come back down again so fast that that doesn't really have time to happen, but it would if we stayed up there in an unpressurized aircraft for a period of time. And believe me, as we went up really quickly. It was a very, very steep angle, and my ears definitely noticed it. I had to re-equalize my ears several times. All right, so that's the trip up. That's in a perfectly good airplane. Now we're going to get to the part about parachutes. So let's talk about how parachutes work differently than an actual airplane wing. So parachutes actually kind of depend on the turbulent flow of a compressible fluid to actually function properly. As opposed to something like an airplane wing where we try to get rid of turbulence as much as possible, for a parachute, much of its effectiveness actually depends on turbulence, which is chaotic. In other words, it's difficult to model, and it's almost impossible to repeat one simulation after another exactly what happens. And we depend on that turbulent flow not only to open the parachute, but also to increase drag and lift with the parachute to make it function properly. In an interesting way, you can think of parachutes, or at least the traditional kind of half-circle parachutes, a little bit like a rocket, where the air being forced up into the chute by gravity as we're falling down is caught, and it's put under very high pressure, and then it escapes back out the bottom and the sides of the parachute. And the escaping air loses pressure as it's pressed out of the bottom of the chute opening, and high-speed molecules leaving a high-pressure system and going into a lower-pressure one is kind of what a rocket does. Though, of course, a rocket works independently of the outside world, while a parachute can only do this if it's descending under load. Still, the physics of the two is similar, so it's kind of cool to think about it in that way. Of course, modern parachutes are kind of rectangular in shape and they act a lot like wings, but let's take a quick look at the history of parachute shapes before we explore current day designs. As many of you probably know, Leonardo DaVinci famously designed a primitive parachute shown sketched here in 1485. And this parachute for a toy can actually work okay. But interestingly enough, with turbulent flow is not scale invariant. In other words, it matters how big these parachutes are and how big the load is, right? So a toy parachute like this can actually sort of function, whereas this would not work at all for a human-sized thing, and it certainly wouldn't work for something really big like a spacecraft. So not to knock on Leonardo da Vinci too much, but let's think about the mistakes that he made with this design. Number one, he has too much structure. You don't need the wooden bracing as the chute is going to open on its own. He also has too few ropes. You can see there's only 4 attached to the parachute itself, and this is what provides the actual structure as the chute opens, and you notice with real chutes there's many more than 4 ropes. And also, interestingly enough, there's no opening at the top of the parachute, so too much lift is generated, leading to instabilities. So Da Vinci's design is too heavy and unsteerable and unstable. And also, he had nowhere to go to get really high enough to try it out, because it actually takes quite a long time and distance for a collapsed parachute to actually open. So of course he could go to like the Leaning Tower of Pisa and he could use a little model of it and he could drop it off. But, you know, first of all, probably no human being was willing to try it, but also there just would have been no room for a human being to do it because there's a lot of physics that has to happen, and it all takes a certain amount of time and distance for all of that to take place, which is why people who are doing even things like base jumping and stuff where they kind of throw the parachute out immediately still have to do that with a pretty tall cliff or building or something, because it takes a long time for everything to unfurl and for all the physics to start to work. So of course, as any World War II aficionados know, modern parachutes started off as spherical sections, which is kind of like slicing off about 1/3 of an apple. And while parachutes were actually around as early as World War I and even before that, World War II was when the technology truly matured into a useful, reliable form. So one major change, of course, from Da Vinci's time was they had much lighter material. They started off with canvas, but then started using synthetic materials like nylon, which of course is still in use now. And of course, weight is a huge factor. Every kilogram that the parachute weighs means that it can take less weight, it can slow down less weight as you descend. Because of course, it has to slow itself down first before it can slow you and it down. So one of these World War II era chutes is baffled into about 26 sections with a lightweight rope connecting the ends of each baffle to a harness that the paratrooper wore. And then in between each rope, the baffles are allowed to take sort of a U shape, which helps to direct the air in a more predictable fashion as it exits the parachute. Interestingly enough, by gathering the connecting ropes on one side and pulling, you could actually do some rudimentary steering, and there was kind of a steering flap in it as well. So there's really interesting stuff that's going on even in this primitive design. Of course, this design is pretty much at the mercy of the wind, however, and many paratroopers died from landing in water or in trees as they couldn't really steer on their descent. And this parachute shape, which is still used extensively for high-speed cases like re-entering spacecraft, etc., has been studied very extensively. And speaking of that, there are a ton of papers on hypersonic and supersonic parachutes and how they work in Martian atmospheres and how they work in our atmosphere, etc. And so a lot of the references that I have in the description are actually finite element analyses of spacecraft parachutes. Of course, with all of these parachutes, I'm sure that you've noticed that there's a hole in the top, and this is actually for increased stability, and it actually doesn't make the chute descend appreciably faster. So as anybody who's tried to jump off of something, like hopefully just a low thing with a umbrella notices, what happens is you immediately flip out from under the umbrella. One problem with the umbrella, of course, is that it's rather flat. It doesn't have enough of a curve shape to it. But the other problem is that without a hole in the top, the system is inherently unstable. And what happens is that you can think about it like taking a bucket underwater, right? If you do that and you trap air in it, it's trying all the time to flip over and to release the air back up into the air because there's a lot of pressure around the system and it's not very stable. So in order to make that stable in motion, what you would need to do is put a little hole in the top of it and allow air to escape as you were descending, and that system would be much more stable. So that's what happens with the air system as well. All of that air that's trapped in the canopy of the parachute is creating a huge amount of pressure, right? And it can become unstable. By adding a little bit of a hole at the top, you allow some air to escape out the top, and it doesn't really slow you down that much, because what it does is it keeps you from rocking like this, because otherwise what's going on is the parachute is attempting to move sideways to dump the air out of it and return to equilibrium pressure. Of course, you as your body is holding it down, but then of course it becomes this big pendulum as you're swinging back and forth. And even with my little toy example that I'm doing here with my little paratrooper guys that you can buy on Amazon if you want, you can see that cutting a hole in the top makes the paratrooper more stable. He doesn't rock back and forth as much, and they descend still about the same speed. So it doesn't really appreciably increase the speed at which you're descending, probably because you're not rocking back and forth as much and dumping a lot of air out of it. So it's a more comfortable ride. It's a safer ride because you don't have the chance of flipping over or something with a parachute, and it doesn't really make you go down a lot faster. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but that's actually a very cool piece of the puzzle when it comes to parachuting, is that letting air through is not necessarily a bad thing. You want to catch a certain amount, but you also want to let a certain amount through. So again, with human-sized parachutes, but especially with big parachutes that are used on spacecraft, finite element analysis and very, very hefty supercomputers are how we examine the way that parachutes behave. And again, we cannot fully solve the Navier-Stokes equations for parachutes. We can only do our best to get as accurate a simulation as possible. And we're still working on that. It's not perfect still, which is why we actually have to do live tests. Again, human-sized parachutes are not as complicated because we're smaller, we weigh less, and we're traveling at a much, much lower speed. But hypersonic and supersonic parachutes are really, really complicated things and still an active area of study. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, you can actually go make a career out of this. And here's a weird thought you might not have thought of before. When we jump out of an airplane, we are effectively something like a parachute. If you think about it, of course, if we spread out our arms, we have a stomach here, right? We have a torso area, we have legs, and we have arms. And all of those things have resistance. And so that actually causes us to fall at a slower speed than it would if our entire weight was, put into like a golf ball size ball or something like that, right? That would drop very much faster. In fact, it would be really interesting to see if a golf ball would fall faster than a human being, like if you drop that with you as you jumped out of the plane, and see whether that, I have a feeling that it's pretty light and so it would actually shoot up relative to you. But it would be a curious thing to see how much weight in the size of a golf ball it would take for it to fall at the same speed as a human being who's doing this kind of a thing. And here's another really fascinating thing that I was not expecting, but there is no roller coaster moment at the moment you jump out of the plane. It was an absolute surprise to me, but essentially what's going on is physics, of course. When we fall through air, the force of gravity, which is 9.8 meters per second squared, eventually balances out with a counter pressure from all of the air hitting us as we fall. So as I said, in fact, we're kind of a parachute. We're just a really, really bad parachute. For human beings jumping out of an airplane at normal altitudes, so-called terminal velocity is around 120 miles per hour or 193 kilometers per hour or 54 meters per second, depending on what kind of units you want to use. So depending on your weight, your shape, the suit you wear, how far your arms stick out, and how pitched up or down or rolled sideways you are, and hey, it's complex, you will actually go around 120 miles an hour or 54 meters per second as you fall. And of course, while you're doing this, you're inhabiting turbulent flow land. Air is screaming away from you, literally, you can hear it screaming by, rolling away in vortices and pulling speed away from you as it does so, friction, viscosity, etc. If you fell in a vacuum, well, first you'd be dead because you couldn't breathe. But if you had a spacesuit on, you would keep accelerating without stopping. From 4,500 meters, you would be going somewhere around 300 meters per second or 670 miles per hour or 1,080 kilometers per hour by the time you hit the ground, so yikes. And interestingly enough, you'd get to the ground in about 30 seconds after jumping out of the plane, and you'd leave quite the crater. So after all, thank goodness for air. So let's go back to the airplane. At the start of freefall, when you jump out of the airplane, everything is very chaotic as you're entering an airstream that's going very, very quickly past you because the aircraft is moving at speed at that altitude. So you could think of sticking your hand out of the window of a car driving really, really fast and how it would be slammed around for a moment as you do that. But then you can actually take your hand and you could control the position of it by making it a bit of a wing, and so you can move it around and it'll make it go up and down. And I'm sure people, at least like me, have done that many times on road trips. It's kind of fun. And so, crazily enough, there's actually no roller coaster moment of having your stomach come up into your throat when you jump out of a plane, because you're going about 85 miles per hour or 136 kilometers per hour already, the speed of the plane, and you simply transfer what is almost terminal velocity in that horizontal direction for terminal velocity in the vertical direction. If you were watching from the ground, you would see you would actually fall backwards from the plane and then arc down into a straight line fall. So since the plane is already traveling very close to a human being's terminal velocity, we're already traveling so close to that, we don't really feel any kind of massive acceleration as we jump out of the plane, which is pretty cool, and it made the jump far, far less scary than I thought it would be. Of course, as many of you have seen from videos, as you fall, you can control your position by moving your arms and legs. Again, sort of like a rudimentary parachute. And if you get one of those bat suits, you can actually control your fall pretty effectively, as evidenced by crazy stunts people do. So you might notice in my Freefall video that we have a little drogue chute sticking out behind us. What is that for? Well, there's two reasons. Number one is stability, because of course with two people you want a more stable system, and that gives just a little bit of drag behind you so it keeps you, facing downward instead of flipping around and doing all sorts of things. Which, by the way, I did. As we exited the aircraft, we actually flipped over. We did a somersault before he, got us all stable and threw out the drogue chute. So that was kind of cool. It was a really wild feeling. But the second thing is actually to keep two people falling at about the same speed as the single camera guy, because after all, we do weigh twice as much as that person. So, we have about the same surface area to the wind, but we weigh twice as much. So we need to slow ourselves down, because otherwise the lovely person who was filming us, Josh, would have fallen much, much more slowly than Bruce and I. And so he would have gotten really bad video, or at least it would have been video of us just going woo and disappearing really fast. All right, so we've done our free fall, and now comes the important moment, the moment of chaos when you actually open the chute. Will it open? Will it tangle? And what happens next? So what are we looking for in parachutes, whether they're human-sized parachutes or spacecraft-sized parachutes? We're looking for stability, and we're certainly looking for repeatability for opening them. In other words, we want them to consistently open and not tangle, or if they start to tangle, they untangle themselves. And by the way, knot theory is another amazing topic, and let me know if you'd be interested in a video on that as well. And of course, as it opens, we don't want too much stress on the system. We don't want to rip the fabric or tear a line, or certainly we don't want to harm the person or the payload. So the opening needs to happen in what's called a reefing system. For large parachutes with like spacecraft, you see they open up in a closed sort of form first because there's a string around the parachute. And then they actually have pyrotechnics, as far as I understand it, that actually cut the string at different places, and then the parachute is allowed to open fully. With human-sized parachutes, there's a secondary piece of fabric that actually gets in the way of the main parachute and kind of distributes air out into the main parachute so that it slows down the opening of the parachute, so it kind of unfurls. Because again, remember, you're going 54 meters per second, and then you're going to drop to maybe going 3 or 4 meters per second. You don't want to have that happen really fast, because it would just be like hitting the ground. It would be really, really bad. So you want to make the parachute open fairly slowly. Of course, you want it to open, but you also want it to open fairly slowly. So that piece of fabric actually gets in the way, and it distributes air out evenly to the entire parachute, and so it keeps from getting hot spots, and it also kind of slows down the rate of opening of the parachute. So all of those are really, really good things. course, the other function of a human-sized parachute is that you actually want control on descent and landing. For spacecraft landing in the desert or in the ocean, you don't really need that. You just do it on a fairly windless day and they come down wherever they come in. But anyway, in general, you want to sort of tame the chaos. You want to ride the chaos because you need that chaos. You need the turbulence to open up the chute and have it effectively work, but you need it to be predictable as much as possible. And that's the interesting tension with parachutes. You're dealing with a fundamentally chaotic turbulent system, but you need it to be repeatable and predictable. That's a hard thing to manage. So what sort of safety mechanisms are there for the parachute? Well, there's one for the main chute, which can actually be packed by anybody, as long as I guess they have taken a course or something like that. But essentially it's a hacky sack or something like that. You reach back and you pull it out and throw it, and it pulls a small chute that then causes the main chute to open. And then I found out there's actually 3 systems for the reserve chute, which has to actually be packed by a certified parachute packer. And this made me very happy because I found out about this before we actually did the jump.
In the VOC, it's called the bottom of the container.
Okay.
Which sits right here. So when you go to pull that out, you want to pull like this so you get wrapped around your arm.
Right. So you're literally pulling the hacky sack out of the
yeah. You're going to be like this. You're going to let it go. And what's going to happen? I don't know if this is cocked yet.
Right.
But this is actually going to catch air and inflate. Yes.
And as it does, it adds just enough resistance to pull the rest of it out.
And it's going to pull this bag. See the rubber band?
Yeah.
That's the line that showed on the rubber band.
Gotcha.
But you're going to pull the canopy out of the bag because you're still falling down
right.
while that's catching air.
Right.
So it's going to pull everything out of the bag. And this is called a slider. And this actually, when we're packing, it actually sets up in the canopy so that when the wind hits, it's not going to hit the canopy directly and cause a hard opening. It's going to hit that piece of fabric. And it's basically going to push air throughout the parachute evenly.
Gotcha.
For a softer opening.
So I've seen in spacecraft, they do reefing, so it's kind of like that on a more simple basis. So it keeps it from just going bang and just opening up. Yeah, gotcha. Yeah.
Hard like that.
Cool. Oh, that's very cool.
And this is what it looks like when it's in the bottom of the container. I don't have a hacky, I have a tuck tab.
Gotcha.
This is what it looks like because it's folded up in there.
So real easy to find if you just reach back and grab it.
Yeah, that muscle memory.
Right.
And then that is hooked, the pilot chute is hooked to a bridle, and that discoloration right there lets me know that it's actually cocked and that it'll inflate.
Gotcha.
Because with these sport rigs, you have to cock the pilot chute in order to get to inflate.
Gotcha.
Otherwise, you could have a malfunction.
But it's super important to make sure you see that little thing that shows that it's cocked and ready.
Well, sometimes it shows color, sometimes it doesn't.
Right.
It's not every rig is the same.
Yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't show color, but before we pack it, we test it. We'll throw it up, pull it down, and make sure it inflates so that when we're ready to jump,
right.
It'll catch air.
Gotcha. Very cool.
If you're worried about something, there's 4 ways for the canopies to come out. 1 for the main and 3 for the reserve, especially on a tandem system. You have the main deployment for the main, and you have the reserve handle. You have it's called an RSL, reserve static line. So if you have to cut away, it's going to pull that reserve out for you.
Okay.
But you still want to practice.
I don't have to do any of this.
No, you're just luggage. You're luggage.
Video with
my heart is racing, John.
Yeah. Let's see.
Look at all this.
I just see now. I geek out because I love gear and technical stuff. I do a lot of mountain climbing and stuff. So the rigging and all these things, it's different, but it's that same sort of all this gear that you have to have.
Well, there's also in every tandem we have what's called, and I have one of my rigs. It's an automatic activation device. You can actually see it right here.
Oh, that's with an altimeter when you hit the certain altimeter or altitude.
Is it measures how fast you're going and how high you are.
Gotcha.
And it's a little the reserve loop goes through a little cutter with a blade. And if it detects you're going too fast and you're too low, it'll cut that loop and pull the reserve out.
So if you hit something like 4,000 feet and you're still free falling, it's like...
Yeah, because the reserve is actually spring-loaded.
Gotcha.
There's actually a big spring that's pushed down so that when it deploys, it pops out and catches air.
Gotcha.
It's not like the normal deployment for the main.
Right.
And you can see right here on the reserve, that tab with the red string, that lets you know that it was packed by a certified rigger. And you have the reserve right here.
Yeah.
This is if you actually pull your reserve handle, That's what pulls the pin out. Then you have your RSL, which is that right there.
Gotcha. So it's multiple ways that it's going to work.
Oh, yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
Actually, it sounds safer than.
So.
Oh, I guess is that us, or is that
I'm not sure. What's your name?
John and Paige?
No, y'all are on load 3.
Load 3. Okay, gotcha.
We brought the hot sauce for you to take back to Atlanta.
Awesome, thank you.
This is cool. See, I'm getting this. This actually sounds safer than mountain climbing because you only have one point of failure with a rope.
The most dangerous part of skydiving is driving here.
So as Downsy said, one way is another hacky sack. There is also a static line, which I gather actually cuts the main line if you have to release it that way. And that would be if the main parachute had gotten tangled somehow, so it cuts away the main parachute. And then the last system is really cool. It's an automated system that detects the speed and the altitude. And so if you're going too fast when you hit something like 3,000 feet or whatever, it automatically cuts the line and causes the parachute to open. And the parachute is actually spring-loaded. So in a spacecraft system, it would be mortar loaded, so you'd actually have an explosive that would shoot it out. But here what you have is a spring. So as the line cuts, it opens up the bag and the parachute pushes out because there's a spring there. So basically you can be unconscious and the system will work just fine, which actually gave me a lot more confidence in the whole thing. So as I'm sure most of you have noticed, modern parachutes are much more wing looking than the old round parachutes, and they actually do function a lot like a wing. And interestingly enough, they have a lot to do with kites. When you do kite surfing or just flying large kites or something like that, they look really similar, but kites and parachutes are actually subtly a little bit different. Both of them use air ram foil design, which takes the basic round parachute style and crosses it with a wing shape like what you'd see on an airplane. Of course, kites are more focused on laminar flow. They want to get a nice wing shape, they want to get laminar flow over it, and they want to generate a lot of lift. If you're doing kite surfing like my niece and her husband do, and they're really amazing at this, you actually get this incredible amount of lift that can pull you up, with the kite. I've tried this a couple times and I kind of suck at it, but anyway, it's really, really fun. And you get that lift and it pulls you off the ground and it's just amazing. But basically you need air flowing over the kite, you need wind in order to generate that lift. Parachutes, you actually want a more rectangular parachute shape so that even if there's no horizontal wind, they're still going to function properly. And of course, you also want more turbulent airflow over this type of parachute because you actually want to create more drag and you want to get more lift from the turbulence because you don't really care about the efficiency of it. You actually want it to be in a way less efficient because then it's more efficient at slowing you down. And again, if you look at this parachute, you can see that that small extra rectangular piece of cloth is a distribution system that reduces hard openings by directing air out to the entire parachute rather than to pieces of it at a time. And it does that throughout the entire descent too. It sort of smooths out the ride so that you don't get buffeting and things like that. So it's really, really nice to have that extra piece. I'm sure that these things were not designed with that to start with, and they discovered that it would be a really good idea after some rough openings and rough, descents. The main thing that's awesome about modern parachute design, the more square wing-shaped parachute design, is that they give you a huge amount of turning control. And this turning control is pretty intuitive. You pull down left and it turns left, you pull down right and it turns right. What you're doing effectively is you're shortening the rear cables on the side that you're pulling down, which makes the effective wing angle of attack bigger, which causes more drag. And if you remember the Clark Y airfoil that I showed that little example of, as you increase the angle of attack, you create a lot more turbulence, and that turbulence creates more drag, which slows that part down. And then what happens is the whole parachute pivots around that thing. So the opposite side still has a pretty laminar flow of air over it, and the side that you pull down gets a more turbulent flow. So there's more friction, there's more slowing down, and so this side actually turns towards, so you turn towards that direction. You could imagine maybe a plank skidding across a slick surface, but then if one side hits a dry patch, an area with more friction, the plank is going to turn that way because this part is going to slow down and the plank is going to turn around it. It's the same sort of thing, except it's in air and it's invisible, so it's a little harder to conceptualize. Holy crap! Sorry I missed the hole, I couldn't find it. Woo! Oh my gosh. Oh my God, that's awesome. All right, so we've done amazing. We've jumped out of an airplane, which is incredibly stupid. We've gone through free fall. We've managed to control that. We've opened up the parachute and everything has worked properly. And we're almost back on the ground, but we still have to land, which of course is the most dangerous moment. As they say, the fall doesn't kill you, it's the landing. As this clip shows, when you come down, you've got both horizontal and vertical speed. The vertical is obvious as you're a weight falling through air, but the horizontal speed is because of the wing shape. You're trading some of the vertical drop into horizontal velocity, so you come in actually pretty darn fast. When I speed up this clip, you can definitely hear that there's turbulent airflow because you can hear the sound of it. It's very, very loud. But a lot of the flow is still laminar now over this wing shape. That is really cool. Of course, there's a big danger that there could be turbulent airflow near the ground of just the wind itself, and that's much more likely than up high as the wind flows across the ground and is disturbed by bumps or trees or whatnot. And of course, you don't have time to make any changes if anything happens at that low of an altitude. So turbulence of the air across the ground could lead to a hard landing, and so parachutists and people who fly up in the airplanes and everything check that very carefully before they go up, just to make sure that they're going to get as laminar an airflow as possible at low altitudes when they come in for the landing. So to do a good landing, what you do is you pull down hard on both sides, which effectively increases the angle of attack of the entire parachute wing, and you get more turbulent flow over the wings, and that of course slows the system of you and the chute down together, and then you get a soft landing as long as you time it out right. Interestingly enough, you can actually almost pull yourself back up into the chute, up into the air a little bit if you time it just right. And of course, as I've been showing with this video, which unfortunately the guy passes right behind the tail of the airplane right at the moment, but just before that, you can see that the back part of the parachute actually pulls down a little bit, and that's what he's using to control his landing and soften it up and make it slower. And so, amazingly enough, we land gently on the ground. Thank you, physics. Thank you, fluid dynamics. Thank you, modern lightweight and strong materials. Thank you, engineers, for designing a great shape. And thanks to Bruce, Josh, and Skydive Monroe for crossing a bucket list item off my list. That was awesome. Man, thank you. So awesome. Me and Paige jumped out of an airplane and we survived. But the big question is, now that I've done it once, would I do it again? Actually, I've already signed up to do level A of the accelerated freefall course. I can't wait. All right, I hope you enjoyed this rather deep dive into parachutes and how parachutes work. If you did, please like the video so other people can find it because YouTube's algorithm works that way. And of course, consider subscribing for more of this type of content and a bunch of stuff on Tesla and other geeky matters. And don't forget about the Whole Nuts and Donuts channel. I would love it if you would subscribe there as well. That would be awesome. Thank you. As always, a huge shout out to my patrons on Patreon, particularly for this video. This video was rather expensive. Had to pay for me going parachuting, had to pay for the handy cam stuff, had to pay for Josh to do the filming. So there was a lot of expenses here. And of course, this is not my normal type of content, so there's a chance that nobody's gonna watch this. So without my Patreon support, this just wouldn't have been possible. So I really do appreciate it. Thank you all so much. And of course, if you wanna join the club, definitely check out the link in the description. And as always, feel free to ask me questions in the comments or at my email address, which is drknowitallknows@gmail.com. Till next time. Bye-bye. Okay, hands are a little shaky. That was awesome. Man, thank you guys.
Would you do it again?
Yeah.
All right.
I'm literally gonna walk out of here and go say like,